On March the 25th, 1911, a fire broke out on the upper floors of a garment factory in New York City. Within minutes, flames spread through the workspace, trapping workers inside. Some tried to reach the exits. Others found the doors locked. As the fire grew, people were left with fewer and fewer places to go. In the early years of the 20th century, New York City's garment industry employed thousands of workers, many of them young immigrants who had come to the United States in search of steady work. Inside factories across the city, long rows of sewing machines filled crowded rooms where workers spent hours each day producing clothing for a growing market. One of those factories was the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, located on the upper floors of the Ash Building in Manhattan. The factory occupied the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the building, where large workrooms were arranged with tightly packed tables, fabric, and equipment. Workers, many of them young women and girls, labored in close quarters, often for long hours, with limited breaks and little room to move through the space. Scraps of fabric and paper patterns were kept nearby as garments were cut and assembled throughout the day. Despite the scale of the operation, safety conditions inside the factory were limited. Exits were few, workspaces were crowded, and during working hours, some doors were kept locked. On the afternoon of March the 25th, 1911, the factory was full. The workday was nearing its end, and inside the building, hundreds of workers were still at their stations. Late in the afternoon on March 25th, 1911, the workday inside the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was nearing its end. Workers remained at their stations, finishing garments and preparing to leave for the day. Near one of the cutting tables, a small flame appeared. At first, it was barely noticeable. A scrap of fabric had caught fire. In a workspace filled with cloth, paper patterns, and loose materials, the flame found what it needed. Those closest to it saw the fire and tried to put it out. Water was brought. Some attempted to smother the flames. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the fire could be contained, but it spread quickly. Fabric hanging nearby ignited. Flames moved from table to table, feeding on the materials that filled the room. Within seconds, the fire had grown beyond what could be controlled by hand. Workers began moving away from the flames, looking for exits as smoke started to fill the workspace. The fire climbed upward. It reached the ceilings, where patterns and materials had been stored, and moved across the room with increasing speed. What had started as a small, contained flame was no longer contained. It had become something else. As the fire spread across the factory floor, workers moved quickly toward the exits. The room that had been filled with the steady rhythm of sewing machines only moments earlier was now filling with smoke. Some workers made their way toward the stairways, following the paths they used at the end of each workday. But not all of those paths were open. One of the exit doors was locked. Those who reached it found that it would not move. Others turned back, moving through the growing smoke toward different stairways or toward the elevators, which had already begun carrying people down to the street. Elevator operators made repeated trips, bringing as many workers down as they could. At times, the cars returned filled beyond capacity. Some workers climbed down the elevator shafts when the cars could no longer reach them. Inside the factory, the air grew thicker. Smoke gathered along the ceiling and began lowering into the room. Those still inside moved between work tables and machines, searching for a way out that was still open. Windows became another point of escape. Some workers climbed onto ledges or leaned out, trying to find a way down or signal for help from the street below. On the ground, people began to gather along the sidewalks, looking up toward the upper floors of the building. Fire crews arrived quickly, but their ladders could not reach the highest levels where the factory was located. Inside, the space that had once been familiar, rows of machines, tables, and materials had changed. The exits were no longer certain, the air was no longer clear, and the fire continued moving through the room. As the fire continued to move through the factory, the number of ways out grew smaller. Smoke filled the upper floors of the building, and the heat pushed workers toward the outer edges of the room. Many gathered near the windows. From the street below, crowds had formed along the sidewalks, looking up toward the upper floors where the fire had taken hold. At first, people called out, trying to guide those inside toward stairways or exits that might still be open. But as the fire spread, it became clear that not everyone could reach them. Some workers remained at the windows, looking down toward the street, where fire crews were still working to reach the upper floors. Ladders extended upward, but stopped well below where the factory was located. Nets were held out below in an attempt to catch those who might fall. Inside, the space continued to fill with smoke. The heat intensified. And for those who could not reach an exit, the windows became the only place left to go. From the street, people watched as individuals appeared at the windows, one after another. Some waited, some looked down as if measuring the distance, and then, one by one, they began to fall. The nets below couldn't hold under the weight and height. The sounds carried through the streets as the crowd gathered below stood and watched. The fire itself remained contained within the upper floors of the building, but the impact of what was happening reached far beyond it. By the time the fire was brought under control, the full scale of the disaster had begun to emerge. In total, 146 people lost their lives in the fire. Many of them were young workers who had been inside the factory at the end of the workday. In the hours after the fire was brought under control, the streets surrounding the ash building remained filled with people. Crowds stood along the sidewalks, looking up toward the upper floors where the smoke had begun to fade. Fire crews moved through the building, continuing their work inside the factory where the fire had taken hold. On the ground, the reality of what had happened was becoming clear. The sounds that had filled the street during the fire, shouting, movement, the rush of people gathering, had begun to give way to something quieter. People remained, but many no longer spoke. They stood and watched as the aftermath unfolded. Across the city, news of the fire spread quickly. Families searched for those who had been inside the factory that afternoon. Hospitals filled. Temporary spaces were used to receive those who had been brought out of the building. The factory itself remained standing. From the outside, it did not appear destroyed. The fire had been contained to the upper floors, but what had happened inside it was already being understood as something much larger than a single event. Investigations began soon after, focusing on the conditions inside the factory. Attention turned to the layout of the workspaces, the number of available exits, and the reports that some doors had been locked during working hours. The fire exposed the risks that had existed inside many workplaces at the time: crowded conditions, limited safety measures, and the lack of clear protections for workers. In the years that followed, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire became a turning point. New labor laws were introduced. Workplace safety standards were expanded. Inspections became more common, and the responsibility of employers to provide safe working conditions became more clearly defined. The changes did not come immediately, and they did not prevent every future accident. But the fire became a reference point, an event that could not be ignored when questions about worker safety were raised. Today, the building where the fire took place still stands in New York City. People pass by it each day, often without realizing what happened there. The city has changed. The streets are different. The sounds are different. But the story remains. A factory floor near the end of the workday, a small flame, and a moment when the ways out were no longer enough. That was tonight's story. You've been listening to The Midnight Box. Wherever you are, thank you for listening. Good night.